So my name is Aziz Rana. I teach law here at Cornell University, and I'm just thrilled first to be here in this bookstore, which is one of my absolute favorite bookstores, so it's wonderful to have this event here at Buffalo Street Books, and then also to be celebrating Jeff Cowie's amazing new book, Freedom's Dominion. So I believe there will be some here to purchase and buy. I strongly recommend that you do so. Jeff is the James Stallman Professor of History at Vanderbilt. But we know him from his time here at Cornell. So he spent many years here at Cornell University, and it's where I got a chance to meet Jeff, and just an incredibly beloved colleague and somebody that to this day is very much missed. And so it's wonderful to have him here back with us in Ithaca, if only for a short period of time. So it feels like a reunion of sorts, in part because I believe that this book project began while you were here on our faculty at Cornell in Ithaca. So Jeff's work, but prior to this book, has predominantly been with a 20th century focus, and he's written a number of books that I'll mention two of. So Staying Alive was published in 2010, and The Great Exception in 2016, and I mention those in particular because for me they've been incredibly influential. So I highly recommend to those of you that haven't gotten a chance to read those books to do so as well. Staying Alive, I read before I think we met, and truly did just blow my mind. So that's a book about the working class politics and culture in the 1970s, and really the decline of class as a rubric in the US and the extent to which that decline has shaped American politics over the last half century. And I think it was a classic then and is rightly understood as a classic today. And The Great Exception is also just a tremendous book, so that much of American popular commentary about the country, its narratives, its meaning, sort of shaped around a set of events from the mid-20th century. The New Deal settlement, civil rights achievements, and then there's a tendency, both in the scholarship, but just also in popular debate and discussion, to read the rest of American history, what happened before and what happened since, through those mid-century events. And what Jeff does is he essentially just flips that framework, where he says, no, actually, these years are what's exceptional and distinctive about American politics. And this is work that he developed with Nick Salvatore, that's here as well. And that really the rest of American history, the stuff before and since, is just much more consistent with the general trajectory of American life. And I think really the last few years since 2016 and the rise of Trump have just underscored the profound truth of that basic insight that they developed together and that Jeff wrote as the book. And here in Freedom's Dominion, in many ways, I think you can see this book as an extension of some of the insights from The Great Exception, but really now extended back to the very foundations and beginning of the American Republic. And what Jeff does here is he takes the concept of freedom, something that is elastic and continuously referenced in American life, and uses it as a way to make sense of the developments that we see more or less around us. That there's a common way, there's a common way that freedom is oftentimes presented both in scholarship and public debate, and that's to think of freedom and oppression as things that are on separate tracks, that there's a story of increased inclusion, increased access to various forms of civil and political and economic liberties. But at the same time, there's a separate story about exclusion, about subordination, about violence towards outsiders, and that these are kind of uneasily joined in collective history and in the contemporary present. And that to the extent that there's a relationship between the two, we tell a story basically of hypocrisy, that we're not living up to our noblest ideals because we're falling into the pit of oppression or exclusion. And what Jeff does really powerfully is to highlight the ways in which, no, these have been constitutively bound together, and that the things that we like, essentially, about the American story of freedom have been organized through projects of explicit dominion. And he does this in a remarkable way by focusing on the story of a particular place. So this is Barber County, Alabama. And as you start reading the book, there's a way in which that specificity has a power, because it's not just a broad conceptual or theoretical argument that you're learning how these two things are interlinked in a specific place and time. But it also can feel like, well, Barber County is in Ithaca, New York. And so that this is maybe the bad old days of the politics of native expropriation or servitude and slavery in the South. But that doesn't really have very much to say about me, where I live, and where I am. And yet, over the course of the book, which really begins in the 1830s with a story of native expropriation and dispossession, all the way to the fallout, really, of the 1968 presidential election and the rise of George Wallace, maybe not as a presidential figure himself, but as an avatar for the future of American politics, perhaps reaching its apotheosis in not just Reagan and Nixon, but Trump as well. We come to realize that this story that is a micro-history of a place is really a story of our country and what's effectively happened to our country, and the extent to which what's happened has been a product of our failure to reckon with the historical roots that existed in places that seem very far away, like in rural Alabama. So, it's a tremendous achievement, and it's wonderful to have him here to talk to us about it. And so maybe just to begin, why did you decide to write about the concept of freedom? It seems so incredibly elastic. Is it fair to talk about freedom through the imposition of violence? What moved you to pick this concept and to then draw down on it?
Well, first of all, thank you for that lovely introduction. It was really good. And thank you all for coming here. This is a homecoming in many ways. When my first book came out, I did a reading at the Women's Community Center through the Bookery in 2000. So that was great. Anyway, so why freedom? The real question is, when I started thinking about why writing a book about the multiple dimensions of freedom, is when I picked up a book called The Two Faces of American Freedom by Aziz Rana. I didn't just turn around and go, it's been done. So what I bring to the table is really kind of a micro-history of what you have already done, and sort of putting it, as you do, in the context of settler colonialism and chattel slavery and other questions like that. But it as you suggest, before I was even directed towards your fantastic book, I found that a couple of things. One, why do we talk about freedom more than we talk about democracy? Right? Democracy includes costs, commitments, compromises, systems, state involvement, apparatus. Freedom is a kind of nebulous thing you can do anything you want with, and I found so many people sort of invoking freedom that made me fearful. And I was like, I think we have different ideas of what freedom might be. It wasn't about freedom to build a political community. And sometimes it wasn't even about civil liberties. It was about your freedom to trample upon mine. And so that churned in my mind for a long time, sort of after the Great Exception, because I began to think about the sort of long history of anti-statism and how freedom became the ideology kind of behind the anti-statist tradition in American politics. And then I stumbled across the place that I wanted to explore that idea, which was this tiny corner of southeastern Alabama.
So what was distinctive about Barber County? So why there? And why did you feel like telling a micro-history was the best way to kind of concretely thematize the relationship between freedom and domination?
Right. Well, the latter part of your question you've already pointed to a little bit, which is that when you hold yourself accountable to a micro-history, a community study, whatever it is, that's your container, and there's not a lot of wiggle room. If you're doing a national narrative, if you're doing a story of America kind of thing, there's a little bit of, you can cherry pick, you can kind of play with your topic a bit. I sort of wanted to commit myself to this space and say, okay, I'm accountable to these people in this place, and what does it mean? And then another reason I wanted to do that was to kind of test my writerly chops a little bit. Could I tell a story? In this case, sort of 4 stories. And so that was kind of the challenge I set up for myself was, what does this look like if I just go to this some place? And I wasn't sure where that place would be yet until it got really cold in Ithaca. And it was literally 20 degrees below zero. And our house was very drafty and poorly insulated, and it was really cold, and we decided we were going to get out. And so the kids demanded beach, and we drove to the Gulf Coast, and we stumbled across this place. And it was one of those places where, you know, your sort of spider senses go off as an historian. You're like, there's a story here. Because most people are going to think I chose it because of George Wallace, because of the 70s stuff. But I didn't. I didn't find out George Wallace was even from Barber County until months later when I began, because I started with the Native American story. And, you know, because chronology is really all historians have. So I started at the beginning, and it wasn't until later I figured out that George Wallace was really the key. And then when I read his inaugural and realized he really didn't talk about segregation, he talked about freedom. I was like, okay, all the pieces have come together. This is fate.
So one more question maybe about freedom that's tied to where you just ended, which is that in some ways, like the debate over the relationship between freedom and the oppression of others can have a couple different camps. So camp number one might be something like, well, the way that groups in history, including, for example, some of the white oligarchs that you describe, came to understand freedom for them was through the actual lived experience of subordination for others. And so it becomes a kind of metaphor for like what you don't want to have happen to yourself. And so it has this kind of positive quality of freedom as the opposite of a type of subordination. But those two things are, in a sense, disconnected, because just because you don't want to have this other experience happen to you, that doesn't mean that you're actively participating in deriving your own liberty or freedom from dominating others. But then there's this other perspective, and here you can see this with Orlando Patterson, who you discuss in the book, where, no, it's not just a kind of metaphor to make you understand what makes you free. The actual experience of asserting control over others, of dispossessing land, of enjoying a kind of racial control or, slavers' domination, that is like some essential, almost like libidinal part of what it means to be free. And I'm curious about like what the stories that you were able to uncover in Barber County tell us about how to think of the relationship between freedom and domination as metaphor or as a kind of lived control that's significant.
Right. That's the crux, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people prefer to see the use of the term freedom as a sort of window dressing, a kind of ideological rhetorical cover for what I want to do. You know, what I want to do is X, so I'll cover it, I'll cloak it in the ideas of freedom. But the more I looked at this, and the more I really struggled with this, and the more I saw how people were invoking it and the results, I think freedom has a very problematic, dangerous, dark element to it, and which is what Orlando Patterson, this historical sociologist at Harvard, also says. And the more you look back on the idea of freedom, you see it even all the way back to Athenian democracy as rooted in a slave society. That the capacity to be free is not just to not be a slave. It's the freedom to have the capacity to enslave. And so from the beginning of sort of the Western idea of this very term, you see them deeply entwined and connected. And then if you take that idea, as we did in the American Republic, and you let it loose in a settler colonial society where land is absolutely central to the ideas of what American freedom is. You don't have to think long to think about how important access to land is to the American idea of freedom. And this is sort of a neo-Turnerian kind of idea, I think, that freedom is in the land and in the struggle over land. It's just not necessarily a good one, as he would have it. And so once I began to see that, and I this kind of dark element to it became very clear to me. And the more it played out in the documents, in the stories that I found, and going all the way back to Indian removal. And then the final kicker on the story is that the one element that sort of restricts that freedom in the story is the federal government. Even during Indian removal, which was like, shocking to me at the time that so Andrew Jackson and his Secretary of War actually sort of intervened on behalf of the Native Americans in this place. And the white intruders are running roughshod right over the federal government and the Creek people along the Chattahoochee River between Georgia and Alabama. And so not only did they define their freedom in access to land that belonged to others, define their freedom in their capacity to subjugate those and kick off those that had the land, but they also define their freedom against federal power that got in the way of full access to that. And it's the same with slavery, I think. And the federal government wasn't like, a complete social justice warrior in this story. It's a very mixed story, but it comes in enough to sort of metastasize that sense of freedom, to really build that sense of fear of the federal government stealing people's liberty, stealing people's liberty to steal other people's land, right? And this ties into a long history in American studies, American history of freedom, of a kind of what Hofstadter called the paranoid style, what Bernard Bailyn saw as a sort of freedom, a conspiracy against the colonialist rights as Englishmen, a sort of, it comes with an anxiety, right, that's rather constant. And so you use the word libidinal, which used to be all over this book. It's really fun. Aziz is like so smart. But I went through and I got rid of it because I couldn't quite get to that psychological, almost kind of dark Freudian dimension to this, right? It was just a little too far, but I touched the flame. Yeah.
So I have a question about the federal power.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that's really distinctive about the book is that if, you would imagine that if you're going to read a book that's a microhistory of Barber County, you expect slavery, segregation, Jim Crow to be at the center. Mm-hmm. You don't expect the first part of the book to really be about the settlement of the land mm-hmm. and its colonization and indigenous expropriation. But what you do in the book is you really, you begin there and then you link that story to the story of slavery. So the question of colonialism becomes bound to the questions of race that might be more familiar to us. And standing in the background of both of those narratives is the federal government. The federal government as the threat to the capacity to claim land and then to coerce labor. But of course, we also know, just from being in this country, that the federal government hasn't been like the font of all solutions. And in fact, through most of American history, the federal government has been on the side of the folks that are engaged in racial subordination and colonization. And indeed, one of the strange things, in a positive way, about reading the first part is reading Andrew Jackson as a sort of hero of the federal government. I'll put hero in quotes.
This is what it's come to, folks.
That's limiting the ability of settlers to claim land. That's obviously a story to pair with the Trail of Tears, right. the history of genocide that Jackson's very closely associated with. So I guess the question is, what to make of the fact that for most of American history, hasn't the federal government been on the side of the settlers? And so why is it that the response is this kind of intense anti-governmentalist response given the basic trajectory of how governments operated?
When did the easy questions start? No, again, right, you have your finger right on the pulse of the project. Because the federal, in the text I call the federal government the clay-footed, weak-kneed hero of this story, right? Because it kind of comes in, does the right thing a little bit, but just enough to drive white people crazy into this sort of frenzy of white freedom. And they will resist the federal government in massive disproportionate energies to what the federal government is doing, right? And I think we continue to see this today. So step one, absolutely, the federal government has been on the side of slaveholders and the colonizers, and certainly the colonization project, and more often than not on the slave project. That's why when it comes out against the very people it's supposed to be for, it takes on this kind of larger-than-life sense of monstrosity and tyranny, and your rights as a free person are being taken from you by the federal power. And they get very, very worked up about it, right? So the Andrew Jackson story is probably the most kind of head-spinning dimension of this book, as Aziz lays out. Andrew Jackson is the person in the Trail of Tears. But in this story, this is after he's taken most of Tennessee, all of Alabama, Georgia, and as a general. But there's this 9-county strip that is reserved for the Creek people along the Chattahoochee, and which is the eastern border of Alabama. And Barber County is right at the bottom of this set of counties. And he says, he signs us a treaty saying this is for the Creek people for 5 years. We're not going to mess with it. We're going to privatize it, which is an old scheme. We're going to turn it into private plots, give it to the Native Americans, and then they can do whatever they want with it. There will be tremendous pressure for them to sell it to white people and move west, which is the end game. So, it's not a story of federal heroism at all. But to back up this treaty, he basically sends in these sort of hapless federal marshals to go patrol a 9-county region and kick out all the intruders. And and they continue to back him up no matter what happens. They're like, he'll write them and say it's going badly, and they'll say you're doing the right thing, and then they burn the town to practically to the ground, and the people in Alabama go crazy, and the federal government continues to back them up, right? But we do have to think about this, and finally it goes terribly bad, and the Creeks look to the federal government. The Creeks are begging for federal intervention because it's their only ally they have in the face of all this intrusion. Finally, they give up. They attack white settlements about 4 years after the first federal marshal goes into this area. And then once war is on, the federal government flips completely, goes back to its sort of ways, backs the white intruders after what's actually called the Intruders' War. And a horrible, horrible, bloody war happens, and the Creeks are eventually moved west of the Mississippi, out to actually Oklahoma, where there's a town called Eufaula, which is in Oklahoma, which is the main town in Barber County. They basically rename this place out there or settle a place out there in their name. So anyway, the point is, both the long game on this is for Indian removal, and even if the short game is protect Native American rights for a short period. That short period, though, comes with massive costs, and the white settlers actually lose their minds over the fact that their man Jackson, the guy who promised them land, the guy who promised them Indian removal, the guy who was going to defeat federal power through the defeat of the bank, is now using federal authority to subjugate them, right? Even if it's not really subjugation. And so it is a complicated dance. Once you that's what's nice about a local story. Once you unpack it, the complexity really comes out.
So
there's a question, but I think we'll wait till the end. Can we wait? Yeah, okay.
I was curious if you could now maybe tell us a little bit about how this story plays out in the context of the Civil War and Reconstruction, because that's another way in which you can say that the long history is quote-unquote redemption, which is the return and entrenchment of Jim Crow politics. Right. The short history is Civil War and Reconstruction, and yet that short history looms large going forward for the rest of the book over the meaning of federal power and the meaning of local freedom.
Exactly correct, yeah. And so the sort of ghost of Reconstruction lasts way longer than, 10, 15, 100 times longer than Reconstruction itself, depending on how you want to do the math. And so, again, you have this story where in Barber County and many, many other places, when the Civil War begins, local people mobilize to defend their freedom to enslave, their freedom from federal authority that's going to come in and threaten that. The first thing they do when South Carolina secedes from the Union is they hang Abraham Lincoln in effigy in the main town, right? And then this continues to be the sort of rhetoric. Obviously, it flags a lot when they're losing the war, but after the war, especially during radical Reconstruction, where troops are there occupying the area, providing civil and political rights to free people, the local whites sort of lose their minds again about their lack of freedom, because it's a zero-sum logic, right? If black people have freedom, white people don't. Right, so the scales have to be rewritten, and they try all sorts of cockamamie schemes to get rid of them politically and everything. And then finally, in 1874, when all the black voters are lined up to vote in downtown Eufaula, they open fire, and they shoot them.
This is obviously an incredibly tragic story. Where does the history of Southern populism fit within this in the late 19th, early 20th century? So the effort especially to organize poor whites and black people in places like Barber County in a way that would conceivably expand the terms of who gets to enjoy the benefits of freedom. So where does that fit within this account?
Again, great question. As I was doing the research on this, I kept postponing populism. I'm like, this is going to be the thorniest mess ever, right? And then, Barber County started doing its magic, and it turns out that the presidential candidate for the Populist Party was from Barber County. Not the president, the gubernatorial candidate for the governorship of Alabama was from Barber County. So, yeah. What's interesting about that, though, is in the Black Belt, populism wasn't that powerful. It was actually up in the northern counties of Alabama where it was much more popular. But my chapter on populism is called, I may muff it, but it's called White Oligarchy as Jeffersonian Democracy. Ann gets it. And the idea is that what the elites do is say, you don't need populism. And the interracial dimensions of Alabama populism were never really powerful. But what the elites do is drag out this Jeffersonian anti-statist kind of agenda and say, well, you don't want government. Government's not your friend. And the federal government is really not your friend. And really pushes through this kind of anti-statism as freedom agenda, and that helps. It's very, very complicated, but the short story is it helps reestablish the planter elite and the what's called the big mules in Alabama, mostly the coal interests, the industrial interests. But they're able to do that essentially by mobilizing this kind of Jeffersonian rhetoric around we don't need government intervention, right? So it in some ways it foreshadows our own time, where we see this sort of kind of anti-statist libertarian rhetoric used to get economic power, right? And so the 1901 Constitution that's passed in Alabama comes after the populist movement, and they're like, we need to really make sure this never happens again. And they basically formally disenfranchise black people, but they also disenfranchise poor whites. And poor whites support this. And this is one of the greatest, political tragedies writ large, I would say, of American politics.
So a couple more questions before we open it up. So I'd like to ask now about George Wallace. That George Wallace looms large over the last part of the book, but one way that he looms is as a kind of inheritor of populism. Mm-hmm. So, for starters, he begins his career, as you note, as an ally of Big Jim Folsom, so who's the quote-unquote racially moderate, kind of populist New Deal figure that's the governor of Alabama in the 40s and 50s. And in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, goes from being identified with a kind of moderation on racial politics to really being the kind of the fire-breathing embodiment of Jim Crow white supremacy. This is not an unusual development in Southern American politics. Mm-hmm. So the person that I was thinking of when I was reading that transformation or the transition was Tom Watson in Georgia. So Watson is the figure of multiracial, class-based organizing through the Populist Party as a young person, a young man in his 30s and 40s, and then becomes the head, essentially, the party boss of the Georgia Democratic machine, and very closely associated with white supremacy, with the politics of and the practice of lynching, with anti-Semitism, with the very, very worst elements of white supremacy. What's going on? I mean, so what is should we read the quote unquote racial moderation as sort of like a purely strategic activity? Is there something deep seated about the turn? Of course, this connects to where you ended your comment about white voters, poor whites participating in their own disenfranchisement as part of solidifying a white supremacist society. What do we make of the transformations or transitions that Wallace engages in over the course of really the 40s to the 70s?
Yeah, I'd never considered the Tom Watson George Wallace comparison. That's really interesting. I'll give some more thought to that. But the trajectory, he was never quite as much of a populist figure as Watson. He was kind of more of a sort of progressive Southern moderate, but he ran basically trying to deliver the goods. He wanted to build roads. He wanted to build trade schools. He was pro-labor, and he was moderate on race, not progressive. He followed Big Jim's footsteps until Brown. And after Brown versus Board of Education, he sort of aggressively distances himself from Big Jim. But the thing you have to remember or know about Wallace is, above any other variable in his life, he was a political animal. And whatever was going to give him political power, and this gets to his popularity, whatever would give him political power, he was going to pursue. I opened the section on Wallace with somebody saying, if you dropped Wallace into the Albanian countryside, he'd be at the head of the Comintern in 2 years. And I think that's kind of who he was. He saw political levers, he pulled them. And so as race turns, he begins to turn. And he runs again as a moderate for governor in the 50s. He gets race baited because now what you see is after Brown, there's a polarization. There's not a lot of space for guys like Big Jim Folsom who are trying to kind of ease their way through it. It's either which side are you on with regard to federal intervention in Alabama. And this is after Wallace loses to a hardcore segregationist. He says this famous line about how he will never be outraced again. And then he goes hardcore. He goes in deep, and he has a winning formula all the way through the 1970s. And then but still, there's two things about Wallace that are really intriguing. One is that he learned that losing was winning. The more you lost to federal power, the more you won local power. And so he would fall forward constantly. He lost every battle. And yet, every time he lost, he would turn it into more political energy to fight the feds. The feds are looming on the horizon, and they're coming for you, and I stand between you and them. And the other is the degree to which he translated that. The other point is the degree to which he translates this into a rhetoric of freedom, into an idea of freedom. It's not just a rhetoric. He, as I've already mentioned, in '63 when he's inaugurated, he mentions segregation 4 times. Once when he says his most famous line, which is segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. He mentions it one other time after that. But he mentions freedom 24 times. And that's doing really important work because segregation gets you the segregationists. Freedom gets you the moderates and the segregationists. And as we learn when he goes national, it will also win him economic elites who are interested in fighting back against federal authority. So he wins, when he runs for president in '64, he has the anti-tax people backing him up, right? So that freedom, he studied Barber County very deeply, and he saw how it worked. He felt how it worked when he was shaking hands in the county seat in Clayton as a child, and he learned it, and I think that he really was able to translate that onto the national stage very, very effectively, where naked appeals to race might not have been as powerful.
So you end the book by, in a way, saying that Wallace's freedom language, effectively goes national with Nixon and with Reagan, and you have this wonderful quote from Wallace saying that, he thinks that after losing to Nixon, that he honestly should be getting royalties because they're basically just taking all of his rhetoric and policy. And that, of course, then leaves us with this predicament about how to think of the language of freedom. Right. The fact that it's so powerful rhetorically suggests, well, it's something that has to be reclaimed, perhaps, by folks that are committed to a more emancipatory politics. Mm-hmm. But its very elasticity and power through this language of domination and control suggests that it has to be systematically rejected. And I'm just curious how you think about that paradox.
I love you, man. I sort of leave us with that puzzle a little bit. So I think the first step is, as soon as freedom is invoked, you need to be very suspicious about what work that's doing. Why is that being invoked and how? Following Orlando Patterson, I unpack freedom into sort of 3 dimensions. One is civil liberties that we know and cherish. The second is the capacity to build a political community. And the third is the freedom to dominate, what he calls it sovereignal freedom. And it's that third one that I think we need to be on a lookout for. The second is, maybe we should be talking about democracy and not freedom. Since freedom is so elastic, since freedom has been sort of hollowed out in this way, that perhaps the struggle should be more around democracy than freedom. And I realize emancipatory groups throughout the world have used this term freedom, and I'm not prepared to totally get rid of it. But I do think we have to consider that if fascism ever comes to America, the banner under which it marches will be freedom. And that's, a scary and problematic idea. So the reason I think democracy is so important is that if we believe in democracy, that means we need to believe in federal authority in a way to oversee the actual voting process, take it out of local and state hands, which is, there's a scene in the book, actually, where the Voting Rights Act is passed. And when the Voting Rights Act is passed, the organizers all go out and they try and get as many people to organize as possible. And then the results go back to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference headquarters, and they're going over the numbers, and they're trying to figure out, why does some counties doing so well and other counties aren't? And Hosea Williams, the King's lieutenant, basically says, he does all the math, and it's sort of this mystery, and then he finally realizes that the counties with high number of registered black voters after the Voting Rights Act is because there was a federal registrar present in the county. So even places with crackerjack organizing drives, good leadership, good community development, all that stuff, without federal oversight of the election, of the registration process, did like half of what the counties with federal registrars had. So, that kind of thing means that, and here I'm talking about democracy as a formal thing, not democratic culture, means something threatening in a certain way, because it means taking it away from the community, voting rights from the community level and the state level, and putting it on the federal level, and enforcement for voting rights on the federal level. I think it also means that you're holding yourself to a completely different standard if you're talking about democracy rather than freedom. You're basically saying that we're together, and we're all going to make compromises and figure out how to work together. And that's part of a democratic culture, and it's messy, and it's unfortunate, and you're going to have your freedoms infringed upon to do that. And that's why I sort of want to shift the thinking, and it's not so much in the book, but I'd like to shift the thinking more towards democracy.
Well, thank you very much. Let's open it up to questions. So I think I saw a hand raised over here. That maybe folks are willing to raise hands, we can have some questions.
Yeah, I have two, but I'll start with my first one. You said that I'm not very familiar with American history, and you said that Andrew Jackson wanted to drive the Native Americans out completely, but for the certain region he only he wanted to do it like sort of softly by giving them 5 years or something, and then do it with privatization. So why did he give them this this soft treatment, whereas he knew all the people would turn against him?
Right, that's an excellent question, and they did turn against him. In fact, the governor of Alabama, who ran on a pro-Jackson, anti-bank agenda, actually comes out against Jackson, and so do a lot of people in the South, which he won every county in Alabama. Andrew Jackson. So this is the difference between being a soldier and part of the administrative state, right? He needs a somewhat rational system to make this happen, and he signs this treaty. He wants us to be run in an organized way. He had just come off the nullification crisis, which is kind of another story of South Carolina's resistance to federal power, and so he is actually interested in making the government run in a reasonable way. And if we go back actually to even his early days as a soldier and an officer, we see him really angry about people who violated treaties, intruders who came in on native lands. And then my final argument about Jackson is there's one thing Jackson hated, and that was anybody who disagreed with Jackson. He was egomaniacal and wanted these settlers to behave as he wanted them to behave.
That was great. You see, I mean, I'll never listen to me and Bobby McGee again. Differently. And you also made me understand why, when Roosevelt gave that speech, one of the smartest, we fight for the four freedoms. Mm-hmm. We don't fight for democracy, which that crystallized, and I had never really understood that before. But even though I like the paintings, but I think what I found ultimately depressing. I was thinking about the last election.
Which aspect did you find depressing?
You know, we had these things where people saying democracy is on the ballot.
Right.
And that didn't turn out well in New York State in our congressional elections, because it turned out it was on the ballot. And you made me wonder, we had one congressional race where the Democrat actually won, which was a guy named Brian, I think he's in the 15th in Dutchess. And he ran, I mean, he was a good candidate, he was an Iraq vet, West Point graduate, but he said freedom is on the ballot. And he was a pro-choice candidate, and he linked abortion rights, not with a woman's right to choose, freedom is on the ballot. And he was really the only upstate insurgent who won, and that's brilliant in retrospect what he did, where he made abortion, and it did not of choice, but of freedom.
Yeah.
And so that's what I found depressing, was that the democracy thing didn't work, but when this very smart Democratic politician linked abortion with freedom, he won.
Yeah, so freedom is, I mean, this is
powerful.
You're right. This is why, going back to Aziz's first question, it is the American creed. It's the fundamental thing, right? And so I can't just wish it away. And that's why your last question was so hard. There it is. It's powerful. But I think in some ways, bringing that out away from what the Freedom Caucus would like you to think is freedom is, yeah, exactly. No, I think the, you know, in general, I think progressives could think more about questions about democracy, patriotism, freedom, a lot of things that they want to shy away from because they've been so loaded and so used in ways that they don't agree with. So I think it's an important project.
Go ahead.
I'd love for you to reflect on what it was like to write this in this last decade of all of these issues that are so historically relevant, but also very frustratingly, unbelievably relevant to now and today. As a historian, are you okay? So that, you know, what was it like to do that? But also, you're now publicizing it, and this could easily get interesting responses from people. And if you can just reflect on this project and this moment a little bit.
Yeah. The writing of this was miserably painful. And the irony of that misery is that I did it at Stanford with a year off with a fellowship at Stanford. So I would write up I have a chapter called Lynching as an Act of Freedom. And, to sit with that I would just be sort of wandering among the palm trees and the breezy air of, with everything at my disposal, simultaneously with this in my head, And so music helped a lot. I was listening to a lot of sad music, that really helped. So, but I think it's important to note that I conceived the project before Trump was elected. So I actually came up with this whole idea during the Obama administration. And so it's not it might seem presentist, but the genesis is I think, looking at an enduring question, not a presentist issue. And yeah, there's some, as historians, all of us, and there's a lot of historians in this room right now, we're all sorting right now, as in a sort of the way 1619 Project has sort of asked us to think about things like, what's good, what's bad, what do we keep, what do we get rid of, how do we think about this country, what's worth preserving, and this has really sent me down that path, I think. But it, as difficult as it was, and I'll wrap this up, putting it together in a writerly way I found really challenging and interesting. So that's what I was really kind of, where I found my modicum of joy, was putting the pieces together.
So that's actually my question. You talked about this as a challenge to your writing chops. Like, can you talk a little bit about what this was like as a writer and what you found out about yourself as a writer?
I'm not very good.
Lies. Self-deprecation and lies.
So don't buy the book, right? Yeah, it was interesting. The first thing I did was you have to read to sort of try to write something that will go beyond the academy, which I think a lot of us kind of want to do, whether we're trying hard or not. You have to get rid of a lot of what you love, which is the reference to other authors, the deepness of the debates, the intricacies. That there was all there, the whole paragraph on Aziz, Rana gone, and you have to think about story, but you can't sacrifice analysis for story, and that's, for me, that was so hard. And so I think I tried to preserve the analysis, maybe a little too much, because I didn't want to go full story. But I would always try to keep a sort of narrative thread. And then there were some things that were just so juicy, like there's this guy ends up being a martyr to the Creek cause, and he gets shot by a federal troop, and everybody goes crazy because he's a federal agent has shot a free citizen of the state of Alabama. And that kind of stuff, it's hard to mess that up. Some of the more stickier stuff, like populism or something, was a little bit harder to do. But it whet my appetite to actually try new frontiers of, bad word choice, new arenas of kind of more creative approaches to history that go beyond even linear narratives.
Any other final questions?
Couple over there.
Larry?
I wanted to ask about the community study and what you think. When I was coming up in grad school, it was kind of the last days of the new social history, and the classic text of the new social history was the community study.
Right.
Then that went totally out of fashion, as far as I can see. And cultural historians, like I was trained to be, really turned away from community studies. And it's interesting that I think if your book was written in the new social history, the title, the place would have been in the title,
right, exactly,
as it always was.
Right.
Roy Rosenzweig or something like that.
Right.
So I'm just wondering whether you think that this is an area ripe for Renaissance, and what kind of tools we can bring to it now that we're after the cultural turn, and have a different kind of understanding of the place of social history, and it's no longer the dominant mode of historical writing.
Right. Yeah. Well, in some ways it's been kind of a lifelong project, because my first book, Capital Moves, was a critique of the community study alone, because it looked at 4 communities and one company that moved through all 4 communities. And what is it? Community's fine, but what happens if you put it on a competitively charged geographic economic grid, right? Now community looks different. All those cultural resources that our elders celebrated suddenly look isolated and weak, right? As compared to what might be available to businesses in other communities. And so I'd kind of put that away, and then, but with this, it's kind of the same thing. A community study alone I don't think would have been very illuminating. But to put it in constant tension with federal power, to flip to Washington, back to Barber County, well, it doesn't literally go back and forth, but it sort of rolls around a little bit, and also to Montgomery, the state capital, really means that you have a much richer, much more dynamic sensibility that, counting the number of wheelbarrows in a community in the Connecticut River Valley didn't really have in the 60s and 70s. And so...
There goes my next book project.
Maybe if you put it in a computer. So I think, the community study is really great, and I really enjoyed that part of it, especially the writerly part of it. But I think there's got to be a dynamism. There's got to be, a little sort of dialectical energy to it that often
One thing that I would just note is that your attention to language, I think, is something that benefited from the cultural. And something that often in the new social history, there was sort of a sense of we were just listening and we weren't reading critically. And it seems like your approach is to really, bring those tools to the work you do.
You're still trying to make me a cultural historian all these years. Larry reviewed my first book and said, "This guy's actually a cultural historian."
So let's thank Jeff one more time for being here to discuss this fabulous new book.
Appreciate it. Great to see you, everybody.